Hello, so we are going to be going over the section in section 3 of fishery resources for the Science Resource Guide. So, in these next two sections, we're going to be going over forest and marine ecosystems that, just like in section 2, we talked about these types of ecosystems that seem natural. However, but in this case, we are going to be observing how they are being managed today by humans. And so they're typically taken in harvests that are supplying timber and fish. And so harvesting usually has a lot of the same concepts that we actually discussed here in agriculture. So we're going to be taking a look at how that impacts that. So first, the packet mentions how in May 2003, Nature published an article talking about how marine fish were in danger of extinction from overfishing. So, May 2003, the journal Nature made headlines on CNN. So, if you just have to remember for a test question that the journal Nature is the one who is saying that the marine species of fish are in danger of that extinction. And it also summarizes an analysis of a lot of predatory fish, such as tuna and swordfish, all caught in 13 major global fisheries. And so there is a decline in the number of fish caught over 50 years, even though there have been a lot more ships. And so this has actually shown a decline in many fisheries. So if they're catching less, that means there's likely less fish, even though they're having more time and fishing boats. And so even at recent studies, we've seen that uh, there are many more fish species that are being harvested at an unsustainable level. So at an unsustainable level just means that their population will be able to be replaced. We've talked about logistic growth here with Peruvian anchovies, and we'll be able to see how fisheries are managed now. So we saw, I just mentioned the Peruvian anchovy fishery, how there's declines of ocean fish populations failing to account for the fishing quotas themselves don't account for environmental uncertainty when you harvest fish. And so when you have different fishing technology, then there was not enough catching. If there was less technology, there was not enough catching to actually deplete the fish populations. However, with a change in technology, as well as economic pressures, there's a lot of more past practices that actually aren't used as much anymore. So 50 to 60 years ago, there were a lot more tedious and dangerous and low yield methods for fishing, such as um, people who are just in small boats and are just waiting on a few fish to catch their line. So this was a very significant less amount of fish that was caught versus nowadays. And so we can see that there are a lot more new current methods that make it easier to achieve bigger catches. So we can go ahead and go over each of these types of um, fishing. So pole and line is fishing for one fish at a time, and this is using small bait fish such as sardines, which scatter towards the top of the water, the surface of the water from those lines. And so a lot of target species are then tricked into preying on those sardines or bait fish. And this is often sustainable because it's such a low bycatch. So less catching a fish that we don't intend on catching. And then we have long line, in which we have a long line, literally, all trailing behind a boat where there's uh, hooks attached to nets to attract those fish. And this is usually used for pelagic or midwater or demersal bottom fishing. So we can see that pole and line is used for surface fishing, whereas long line is typically used for midwater or bottom. Now, pelagic, just whenever you hear that word, because it's gonna come up later, it means just in the middle of the water, versus demersal means bottom. Now, this can actually have a bad impact on fish, birds, and other life that they aren't being targeted. So this makes it a little less sustainable than pole and line. And then we have gill nets. This is a wall or curtain of net that hangs in the water. So the net is just kind of hanging there. And this also has a high bycatch. So there's not, it's kind of hard to have just targeted nets for just specific fish. But overall, there is a low environmental impact because it doesn't really touch the bottom of the seabed. And the main way of targeting specific fish with this type of gill net is if you change the net meshing. So like the crisscrossing, if it's smaller, then you're going to catch smaller fish. If it's bigger, then you're only going to catch bigger fish. Then we have purse seine. So you could think of this as literally like a purse. It's like a bag. And then sin can I think of like the river sign. And so I think of that just means water, even though it probably doesn't. But this is usually used for species such as tuna and mackerel. So you can remember we want that tuna and mackerel in our purse going along. So just remember you're putting that tuna and mackerel to be ready to eat later on and for lunch in your purse there. So how does this person work? Well, it has this vertical surrounding net, as you can see in the picture, that brings the bottom drawn together. So at first it's a vertical, more like a cylinder, and then slowly the bottom is drawn in. And so this is like tightening those cords of a drawstring purse, as it says there. And there's usually a low bycatch and no contact with the seabed. So it's well targeted. So we can say that it's more sustainable than things such as a long line. And then pots and traps. So these are made of wood, wire, or plastic, and usually they're used for crustaceans like lobsters and crabs. And so there's there's these cone-shaped entrances to where animals are climbing into the cages and then they can't escape. And so usually they're put onto the seabed for 24 hours and then they're brought back up for the catch of the lobsters and crabs. And so this is along the bottom, so there may be more environmental damage than, say, a couple of these other ones like Persen. So remember, if it touches the seabed, it's going to be have a greater environmental impact. Then we have dredging. So this is where we have like fixed in place. That's what rigid means. Rigid structures, which are slowly moved across the seabed. And so there is a bar at the bottom that either has or doesn't have teeth to try and remove the shellfish. And so there's shellfish sitting at the bottom of the sea, and usually it just drags over uh, that different sediment on the bottom, and it takes in the shellfish as it goes along. And so this specific use is for scallops, oysters, and clams, which are classified as bivalves. So you can think of bivalves like it has two valves, like almost like a clam. It opens up by valves to valves. I'm just making that up, but to remember, scallops, oysters, and clams usually have those double layers. And so this once again is going to have high ecological damage because it's rubbing against that sediment and it's really digging in. So then pelagic trawl, remember pelagic means middle of the sea. And then we have here, it's unlike dredging or bottom trawl. It doesn't touch the seabed. And it's cone shaped and it just has one end closed in order to trap the fish as it moves along. And we use acoustic technology to check where is the depth of those fish that we're looking for. And there is some bycatch here, but we can implement new technologies in order to limit the bycatch of fish that we don't intend on taking in because of those locating position here. And then we get the bottom trawl, which it is just like the pelagic trawl, except it is on the seabed and it's very efficient in capturing large amounts of fish, and it can have lots of large impacts on bycatch and seabed damage. So as we can see, there is clearly um, both dredging and bottom trawl are most likely the highest environmental impact here of all of the different types of fishing. So hopefully all this will help you remember what each of these mean, and you remember that specifically dredging catches bivalves. Now, dredging, I could also imagine like dredging seems like a very harsh word. So like it's you need the harshness in order to catch those bivalves because they have two things that they're sticking on. They're more complex of organisms, and so it's a more complex type of fishing, perhaps, is how you could connect that. So, schooner and dories of the past have been now replaced by large factory ships that now go and fish and stay at sea for months at a time. So they usually um, will just stay on the sea, keep fishing, freezing the fish, and keeping them since we have those new technologies. And now most marine fish are caught by huge trawler nets or drift nets. So remember, we had pelagic and bottom trawls or drift nets. And so these are pulled behind the ships or by very long fishing lines with multiple hooks. So that's a long line, remember? And so that's most marine fish nowadays. So most fish aren't caught by pole and line and these other methods of like gill nets and purse seine. And I'm not sure about pots and traps, but clearly a lot of these are now used to catch fish, which can have a negative environmental impact overall. And note, ground fish and shellfish are caught by dredging. So we talked about dredging. Dredging is a type, actually, just like pelagic and bottom trawl, a type of trawl net. And so they're weighed and then pulled across the ocean floor rather than just put at the bottom. We have those weights and possibly teeth as well. So not only do these fishing methods greatly reduce the abundance of the species that are being targeted, but we also can see that they have bad effects on the other species around them. So often commercial fish are known as keystone species, which we talked about in section 2. And usually their loss has this cascade sort of thing, where the biological community will usually have a decline or loss because of this. And so large predatory fish usually act as this population control. So this is an example of a keystone species here. And for population control for the species lower on the food web that also serve as a critical food source. So both the lower food web and large predatory fish that are being targeted can have the fishing of them can have a negative impact on the overall biological community. And then drag nets such as dredging and the bottom trawl can and the pots and traps here can hurt the ocean floor, and so this will hurt the overall rocks, coral, and sea plants. So that's more harm to the bottom of the ocean. And then we also have one of the most serious consequences that we've talked about is bycatch. So this is non-commercial species, so the species that aren't being targeted that are being caught just like the targeted species. And so one of the main populations of this is sharks. And so we can also see that this includes dolphins, caught in tuna nets, and endangered sea turtles that are caught and drowned in the shrimp nets that are used in the Gulf of Mexico here. So we can say that maybe we might be tested on which of the following animals is endangered. And the answer would be sea turtles because they are endangered here. And so we can see they will be caught and drowned in the shrimp nets that are used in the Gulf of Mexico. So we find sea turtles in the Gulf of Mexico, and dolphins are also caught in tuna nets. So turtles to shrimp, as dolphins are to tuna. And then we see that sharks are also targeted. Not targeted, they are accidentally caught. And now we need to ask, how are we actually going to sustain fisheries and how are we going to manage them? And so, overfishing, one of the main causes of it is economic pressure. There's high cost of new technology and there's a lot of competition in local and international markets. And so, there are a lot more higher fishing quotas, even though they even though they should be setting quotas in order to set them according to, well, how uncertain are we that this is going to harm our fish populations? And so lots of countries and around the world have decided they're going to make management plans for fisheries, and they're often in cooperation with each other. So this idea of international cooperation is actually really important because if you think about it, fish aren't defined by the borders of countries. So if fish move from one area to another, we really need those different nations in order to be able to work together in the interest of sustaining the fish populations. And so a lot of fisheries lie in international waters, as I just said. And so one of the main ways that this is done, how we keep managing fisheries in order to keep them sustainable, is using economic incentive. So if they practice sustainability and they have laws, regulations, and plans based on environmental science to show that the fish are being managed, if they have those things, then they will be economically incentivized to continue that. And if they enforce the sustainable public management. So enforcement is also very important, not just saying the laws, but enforcing them overall. So now that we know we need to use economic incentive in order to continue to practice sustainability, what sorts of economic approaches can we take? So One example is waters off of Alaska in commercial salmon fishing beginning in the early 1800s. So remember, early 1800s is when salmon fishing happened by non-Native Americans off the coast of Alaska. And so if anyone had a large enough boat and the equipment, anyone could fish the salmon. However, then the catch started to decline. And so fishery managers would then initiate controls until the population recovered. So there was these rules set in place for fishing populations in salmon. Then, after 1940, the salmon had an increased demand and higher fishing technology. So this actually outpaced the controls that were placed on by fishery managers. And so there was a decline in the salmon population overall. And so by 1970, there was only a 5 to 6 day Alaskan salmon fishing season because of the population decline, because of improved technology and demand for salmon. And so there was high scientific uncertainty about the ecology of salmon that overall made it impossible to develop effective scientifically based management plans. So, because the salmon had unpredictable patterns in the way they lived and were caught, then it was impossible to look for management plans that were scientifically based. So there was an uncertainty about how salmon are actually living. So they instead chose to take responsibility for the salmon, and they were giving this responsibility to the fishers. So this system was an economic system known as the Individual Transferable Quotas System, so ITQs. And so each fishery manager, they they gave uh, a total amount that the fishers could catch. And so the the quotas were distributed based on the fishers or fishing companies' history of fishery in and their participation in the hit in history. So if they participated in fishing in the past, then they may be given an intertransferable quota in order to establish fixed or variable amounts to catch. So these intertransferable quotas, something important about them is they came about because there was high scientific uncertainty. So there may be a question asking about scientifically based management plans, and maybe it will ask like, in what way did fishers manage the salmon population off the coast of Alaska? And one of the options might be a scientifically based management plan, but you need to know not to select that distractor because they did not use scientifically based management plans. They used economic based management plans that placed the burden of fishing quotas upon the fishers themselves. And so because there's only an amount that can be caught in a certain area, then the fishers didn't need to get bigger boats and better equipment to try and outcompete other people because there are already quotas and people get a max amount as it is, so they aren't competing as much. And so if they are if a fisher is unable to catch enough fish in order to stay afloat when it comes to money, then they can actually sell all or part of their quota, the ITQ, individual transferable quotas, remember, and they will be able to do that instead of putting more effort into fishing because that will allow them to be more economically viable there. And so, usually, sometimes herders will use common ground like grass in order to graze. But those people with ITQs, they they want property in the water that will give them fish that they can catch in the future as well. So they want an area that will give them fish now and in the future. And so we can see that there's a shift in the way that fish is being caught. It's no longer everyone just try and go and fish as much as you can and improve your technology and compete with everyone else. But instead, we have these quotas where there are set boundaries to where you can fish, and there are amounts that you can fish as well. And so, because of this program, the salmon population and harvest overall has increased, although slowly. And so, mostly, there are family-run fishing operations that these Alaska ITQs are sold to. But large fishing companies are also managed in places like New Zealand here, where they'll be able to set these quota amounts for different companies and be able to be traded. So then we can look at, okay, what's the ecological perspective of fishery management as a whole? So, not only are there economic interests that are used in fishery management, but we can also take a look at the political and environmental science concerns that have to do with fishery management. So, as we said in the previous section, it's important that we have the ability to have international cooperation here, so managing fisheries. So we want to control the damage that might happen as a result of fishing on the fish species and ecosystems. So one way we do this is through exclusion zones, ranging up to 200 miles around the fisheries. So in 1976, there was a 200-mile exclusive fishery zone that was managed by the National Marine Fisheries Service and 8 regional councils. And so this National Marine Fisheries Service was within the Department of Commerce, and the 8 regional councils were made up of government and industry representatives who were advised by the National Marine Fisheries Service fishery scientists. So these 8 regional councils and the National Marine Service are all who manage this 200 mi mile exclusive fishery zone. And so if there's ever a question of how many different groups manage the 200-mile exclusive fishery zone that was established in 1976, well, the answer would be 9 because you have the National Marine Fisheries Service and the 8 regional councils. And they are then advised by the NMFS fishery scientists. And so the focus of this 200-mile exclusive zone was mostly to preserve the fisheries as an economic resource. However, in the 1990s, as those fisheries began to collapse, especially in the Northwest Atlantic region, so we were talking about Alaska, so that's going to be our northwest, although the Atlantic region isn't quite there. So perhaps more northwest, referring to on this border here of the Atlantic. So not Alaska. That would be the Northwest Pacific. And so clearly the approach of just as an economic resource was not sufficient enough to sustain. So there are several shelf ecosystems, they're called, that go from the northeastern US to southeast Canada. And most of the area is under the jurisdiction of the US, other than the Georges Bank on the Canadian side. So there's a Georges Bank here, and that is not under the jurisdiction of the US. So we can remember that Georges Bank is under the jurisdiction of Canada. And then usually these Northwest Atlantic fisheries were some of the world's most productive. However, they had a catastrophic depletion of fish. And so we can remember this is specific for cod and pollock. So if you need to remember the different fish that are being caught, if you remember the purse seine type, that caught tuna and mackerel. And then if you remember, the dredging caught bivalves such as scallops, oysters, and clams. And now we're talking about more types of fish here, where we are talking specifically about cod and pollock populations. So these are the populations that were depleted in the northwestern Atlantic fisheries. And so this is because of the overfishing from international fleets of factory ships. So the factory ships is the improved technology there. And so we could say that the overfishing was as a result of the new and improved technology. Now, Georges Bank is relatively shallow and highly productive. So we can see that the Georges Bank, it doesn't show it in this image, but it's on the Canadian side, we know. And it's the most highly productive. So there's a lot of biomass area off the New England coast. And although a lot of the bank itself is within 200 miles exclusive economic zone of the US. The northeastern part of the banks are in Canadian borders. So we can see all of this is probably the Georges Bank here. And there are parts of the bank. So we can see that a small area of the Georges Bank was on the Canadian side. So both Canada and the US share this. And we can see this US-Canada boundary here. And we may need to remember that New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are two that lie on this area of the Georges Bank. And so we know Georges Bank is going to be also less than 100 meters in depth, and that the exclusive economic zones are 200 miles around. And so because the fisheries were forced to close down from the depleted stocks, the Canadian government and the US actually imposed a moratorium on ground fishing. So they stopped ground fishing altogether in the area, just like the US, and the US did it in a lot of Georges Bank as well. And so because of the collapse in, once again, the cod and pollock populations here, the US decided to pass the Sustainable Fisheries Act in 1996. So do you remember 1976 was when they made the 200-mile exclusive fishery zone, the National Marine Fishery Service and the 8 regional councils. And now they've in 1996 passed the Sustainable Fisheries Act. And so this actually showed a shift from economic sustainability to an increasingly conservation-minded species sustainability approach. And so, since this act, there has been a lot more organization in the NMFS around sustainable fisheries, recovery of protected species, and a healthy marine habitat. So remember, this all has to do with, well, sustainability is keeping the fish populations above uh, dying, and then recovery of protected species, those species who might have had a high depletion, and then a healthy marine habitat, so not destroying the environments at the bottom, for example. And so, like, one example of this would be for endangered species under the Endangered Species Act, ESA. Sustainable fishery means they aren't going to fish those types of uh, fish. So, for example, cod fishery, those populations have to have time to recover, and so they are not allowed to be fished at all. And so, one part of this, one part of the Endangered Species Act is making sure the habitat for those species is being protected overall. And so, this allows for the long-term sustainability of the fish species. And so we can see as well the most of the Sustainable Fisheries Act was for conservation, restoration, and management. It actually doesn't mention environmental science or ecology, and they aren't really ecologically minded. And so the fishery managers themselves, not just the act, actually has to do more to incorporate this onlook of environmental science as a whole, and how does this play into the fisheries? And so, one example of this is the Georges Bank fishery, which is going to be discussed here in this environmental science case study. So, the people who are involved in this environmental case study were Michael Fogarty and Stephen Murawski. And they were both scientists for the National Marine Fisheries Service in the late 1990s. And they actually looked at a lot of decades of data on Georges Bank. And so they looked at, okay, how has fishing impacted individual species, a complex food web, and an entire ecosystem? So looking at the lower levels of organization all the way up to the higher ones, from individuals to an ecosystem as a whole. And so we can see that Fogarty and Murawski found variations in species and how the total fishing effort actually changed the biological communities and the physical habitat in Georges Bank. So they saw when there were variations in the species that were harvested and the variations in the fishing effort, then the communities as a whole were changed. In the early 1960s, before the 200-mile limit was established, there was a lot of foreign fleets that were fishing a lot of different fish populations. And so this led to the reduction of quantity of species like mackerel and herring. And this meant that a lot more species of fish that didn't really have much commercial value, so not very much economic value, were increasing in population. And so in 1977, when the 200-mile limit was established, the domestic fishing fleet the domestic fishing fleet itself that dominated the fishing retargeted cod, flounder, and haddock which resulted in the decline of these populations and a return of the targeted species. So because this domestic fishing fleet began to dominate, I believe. Let me check. Oh, I see. So the domestic fishing fleet was targeting cod, flounder, and haddock, which made these fish decline, and the formerly targeted species of the herring and the mackerel, those targeted species were able to recover. But these recovered populations created an increased predatory pressure on a lot more young species such as zooplankton. So young zooplankton, that's what juveniles mean. Young zooplankton were being targeted by herring and mackerel who increased in population because of a lot more domestic fishing that targeted cod, flounder, and haddock. And so this changed the spatial distribution of the species because of these different fishing patterns. And so before this, before this fishing of cod, flounder, and haddock, this heavy fishing of these specific species, also, what method of fishing targets mackerel? That's right, purse seine. And what is the other fish that purse seine targets? That's right, tuna. So we can see that species were greatly distributed throughout the Georges banks, and now a lot of the populations are not spread out as much and now only shown in the closed areas that are shown here in the figure. So we can see that there's a lot originally high population and there was intense fishing, and it was closed in 1994 to allow the species to recover. So these are the closed areas in Georges Bank that are shown here. And so we can see that they're a lot more concentrated. And so because the grounds of fishing weren't anymore available that had a lot of concentration of fish because they were closed off in 1994, the fishers moved to the areas around them. And so they kept trawling for lots of ground fish. And so this damaged the ocean bottom habitat. And this meant that cod and flounder juveniles, or young fish, were then greatly killed. So that means that the cod and flounder that we were talking about earlier, they were then more concentrated in those closed areas because they were being fished around those areas. And so the spreading out of them was decreased. And so this also happened because of scallop harvesting. So if you remember, scallop harvesting is mostly happening with dredging or going along the ocean floor. Scallops are bivalves. And so we can see that the scallop harvesting also disrupts the ocean bottom because it is dredging. And so we can see that intensive fishing doesn't just impact commercial species, but also non-commercial species, all in the same food web. And so even more controls from 1982 to 1994 with quotas of control of mesh size actually failed to reverse the declines of lots of fish species because fishing overall disrupts food webs. And so these measures from 1982 to 1994 in the U.S. Georgia's Bank, they they did not take into account the disruption to which food webs may be causing. And so there is closures that allow for the decline of commercial species to reverse. So we are seeing a more increase in those commercial species. So those closures to allow habitat restoration are important. But overall, we see that long-term monitoring of population size is important to overall show better management strategies for an ecosystem and restore sustainable fishery. So looking at long-term monitoring rather than just short-term, oh, we are going to fish less in this current moment. We also need to look at habitat uh, destruction as well. And so we want to move away from these reliance on quotas and look at it from a holistic and ecosystem level. And so we can then expand the closed areas concepts to include a lot of areas, a lot more areas in marine protected areas, MPAs, which allows for the ecosystem to be preserved as a whole. Next up, we're going to begin discussing forestry resources and how that's almost similar to fishery resources as well. So forestry is also known as silviculture. So silva means forest in Latin. So that's where we get that word silviculture. And it's the management of natural or planted forest ecosystems for human benefit. So this could be almost analogous, it says, so very similar to agricultural systems as a whole. And so because the natural ecosystem of a forest is connected through nutrient and water cycles and provide a lot of organisms that provide resources for organisms that pollinate and fertilize trees. They're all connected in this ecosystem here. So we can see that this timber that's being used is connected in an ecosystem. And so it's important to realize that when we're doing silviculture. And so usually in a commercial forest, humans will plant nursery bred trees. So they'll choose what trees they are planting, and they will then take out a lot of the outputs, such as like wood, uh, to the human dominated techno ecosystem. So this is just literally a planted forest where people are harvesting. And so usually, even though there are certain different products that can come from forestry and agriculture, they have the same end goal, domestication and manipulation of ecosystems to maximize commercially valuable species. So plants, in this case, trees that are valuable to people, we are trying to maximize. And so, in order to continue that production of wood, we need renewability and sustainability. Now, what's the difference between renewability and sustainability, you may ask? Well, renewability mostly looks at the ability of a piece of land to support continuous rotations, which is the cyclical replanting and harvesting of trees. So, how easily are we able to replant trees over and over and gather their resources? Whereas sustainability means that various forest species can be maintained over several generations of rotations. So renewability is just the ability from one rotation to the next to be able to replant and harvest trees, whereas sustainability is being able to have lots of generations of those rotations. And so we can use environmental science in order to aid in achieving these aims overall. So let's take a look at what are the methods of harvesting trees as a whole. So if we take a look at this figure here, this actually very nicely lays out what the different methods are. We have selective cutting, shelter wood cutting, and then just clear cutting straight up. So we're going to explain what each of these mean in this section. So forest management, a stand is the principal unit. So a stand is like how many trees we are it's like a unit almost like how we have an acre for land. Well, a stand is a certain amount of trees or in an area of a forest. And so a stand is usually homogeneous, meaning mostly the same in age, species composition, and physical environment. So a lot of these stands have the same sorts of species and physical environment and age. And so in order to determine what is the structure of any given stand, we must look at the method that's used to harvest the trees in the stand. And so usually there's two main types of harvesting wood, and that is even age and uneven age harvesting. So first, let's explain even age harvesting. Even age harvesting is when all of the trees that are being harvested are all the same age, which means that you're removing all of the original trees in a stand, which is clear cutting. So even age harvesting requires clear cutting, which is removing all of the original trees in a stand. So all of the trees that are the same age, even age, they have the same age, even. And so if it's been clear cut, then usually you have to replant or reseed the the stand by foresters. And so this will create even aged trees and in a plantation. And so this is ideal specifically for fast growing species that need a lot of light to obtain maximum growth rates. Because if you kill every tree off in an area and then replant them, and if they're fast growing, then they're going to all be able to grow back up all in one generation. And they also will all have enough light to share because not bigger trees will not shade them from the sun that they need. Now, this is the easiest harvesting method and in most cases, most economical. So it's going to give a lot of profits and it's easiest. But it may not be economically efficient if the commercially valuable tree species, if you have in that stand, remember there can be multiple species in a stand, but if there is only a few species that make a lot of money, then it may not be as efficient, especially in tropical forests. So even age harvesting, it may be asked a question like, which type of harvesting method are you least likely to use in tropical forests? And the answer would be even age harvesting or clear cutting because the econ an economically viable species that make up that stand are not going to, there aren't going to be as many of those. There's only going to be a fraction of them. And then we have uneven age harvesting, in which the harvested trees, unlike the even age harvesting, are all different ages. And so this is usually happening through selective cutting. So we see selective cutting here. And this allows for optimum growth for shade tolerant trees. Because if you're cutting some trees around, but there are still some trees left, those trees will shade the younger trees because the seedlings in young trees must grow next to the larger trees. And so this means that there will be just small openings here and there for young trees and seeds to be planted. And so we can see that there are different stands of uneven ages here. So, in addition to selective cutting, we also have this idea of shelter wood cutting, which is the most complicated. And to explain this mostly, in its essence, it is a single, or not a single, it is each stand is harvested over lots of years through a series of cuttings. So we aren't just targeting selective trees, we are targeting specific parts in stands. However, regrowth this allows regrowth to happen so that by the time of the next cutting, the next generation that's already growing back up can have a successful and rapid regeneration. So we are cutting certain parts of a stand in order to allow for regrowth in those parts by the time we cut the next part of the stand. And so this is the most complicated and therefore least used. And so each of these have different consequences in the ecosystems that they are in. And so, since selective and shelterwood cutting don't clear as much areas as clear cutting, then the environmental effects are less. This should be very understandable because clear cutting clearly impacts the environment more than shelterwood and selective cutting would because more is being taken out all at one time. So let's take a look at intensive forestry. So usually foresters have relied on this idea of intensive forestry in order to have a continuous production of goods and services. And so these are intensive forestry is the cornerstone, meaning like the base. It is what is mostly used for forest management in both public and privately owned forests. So both public and private forests, this is being used. So just like intensive agriculture, we see that for intensive forestry is maximizing the short-term gain by producing as much timber each year as possible. And so if we use methods from intensive forestry, then they can increase forest growth rates and thus maximize short-term gain and possibly even long-term gain. So, but I would say if it's asking the question, it should be maximizing short-term gain. And so plant and animal breeders are selecting often for growing cattle or wheat, making sure you're selecting the animals and plants that are best and most economically viable. Foresters choose faster growing genotypes of trees so that they can harvest them more. So for these trees, then a single population or stand will usually contain most of the genetic variation for that species. So we want in intensive forestry, we want a single population or a stand of a certain amount of trees to have most of the variation of that species all contained within the stand so that because we need the fast growing genotypes, so they'll typically all have um, similar genotypes and thus all the same variation within them. And so one example of this is a loblolai pine tree, which is a timber species in the southern US. And this actually in a single stand of these usually represents 92% of the total genetic diversity of the species. We're trying to get as much as the of the genetic diversity uh, as we can in each individual stand. So, as we're going to see down here, this reduces genetic variation and thus reduces fitness because there is so much of just the genetic variation focused within these stands. There is a reduction in the variation because they're all then selected for in order to be the genotypes that the foresters want them to be. So by 1992, we see that 90% of all new loblolai plantings, so this is in the southern US specifically, or 1.5 million acres, all were genetically selected. And the growth cycle actually reduced by um, almost 15 years over a 20-year period. So we can see that since they were selected, the growth cycle is much, much shorter, 15 years shorter over a 20-year period as a whole. And so this actually means there's a 12% gain in wood volume per harvest over the non-selected trees. So there's a 12% gain in wood over those who are not genetically selected. So 12% more wood is produced when you genetically select the trees, which was made up by 90% of all these loblolai plantings in the southern US. And this means that there will be more timber and more money per harvest. And so as we mentioned earlier, this means less genetic variation and less fitness. And so, in order to maintain this genetic variation, in order to keep fitness higher, usually the foresters will use some natural trees in a selective breeding program or crossbreeding individuals from these different populations here. And so in order to manage these trees, then we need to have a little bit of genetic variation in there. And then we have vegetation management. So we're in vegetation management, this means we are reducing or eliminating all of those plants that we can't sell. And therefore, we're able to have a increased growth rate for the trees that we are selling because they don't have to compete for the limited resources. So if there's limited resources in a stand, for example, then we don't want to grow as many trees that are not able to be sold because then the commercial trees will not grow at a faster rate. And so usually herbicides are used in order to kill deciduous trees, shrubs, and grasses, and these then will not affect the trees that are going to be sold. But environmental scientists have seen that herbicides introduced into ecosystem pathways are could be bad for the environment, and therefore this is controversial. And so also removing the species that are not sold can hurt the community structure as a whole. And this is because they play an important role in the ecosystem. They replenish nitrogen in the soil, they aid in restoration after any disturbances with the populations, and then they also increase conifers' resistance to insects, pathogens, and fire. So each of these, remember, nitrogen in the soil, restoration, and resistance from bad stuff. This means that uh, we maybe instead of removing all of these, modern commercial foresters instead try and control their density and use them when they're needed and remove them when they're not. So controlling how are we going to use the non-commercial species to benefit our commercial species. So if they're hurting our commercial species, we don't want them. But if they are helping our commercial species, then we do want them. And so forest production overall has improved because of intensive forestry, but this is only focused on short-term production. And there, even when scientific methods are used, there are a lot of environmental problems that can result from intensive forestry. including biodiversity loss and loss of habitat and species, either from fragmentation of forests into um, different areas, or this is also known as being isolated into islands. So the forests themselves are being isolated because of fragmentation. And so we need to then get into ecologically sustainable forestry. So, what is ecological sustainable forestry, even in relation to intensive forestry? So, ecological sustainable forestry is addressing the problems that may arise in the environment from intensive forestry. So, Aldo Leopold actually created this, and he summarized it by saying that land was a community of interacting and interdependent parts, all of which may be cared for. Now, although Leopold was quite the prolific writer, and so if you want to learn more about him, go ahead and go to the literature resource guide and go and check him out because he's pretty important for that. So we can see that in this approach of ecological sustainable forestry, both trying to increase growth rates, which is still important, is just as important as maintaining the species, community, and ecosystem levels of biodiversity that we talked about in section 2. And so we want we want to maintain all species, including that can be sold and not sold, of plants and animals as well, close to the natural ecosystem as possible. So while still yielding a lot of wood and other outputs from forests in order to sell, we also want to keep the ecosystem intact. And so we want to remove trees, but make sure that we're removing them so that we will not affect the non-commercial species. And so the U.S. Forest Service in American national forests is one of the stated goals. Ecological sustainable forestry is one of the stated goals in this organization of the Forest Service and American National Forests. Um, and this is practiced in not all countries, but several. And so let's take a look at forestry in the tropics to begin. So if we look at tropical forests, there are lots more types of forests than just lush jungles like in movies, but there's like dozens of types of forests, and there are two major tropical forest biomes. So that's looking at the biomes that we talked about in section 2. And these forests covered over 15 billion acres, which is 6.2 billion hectares of the globe. So all these tropical forests actually take up a lot of area in the globe. But between 1985 and 1990 alone, 200 million acres, which is 85 million hectares, were destroyed. And with this with this destruction, we actually have a rate approaching about 2% per year. So we can see that there are a lot of different types of forests, and forests cover a lot of the area of the earth, 15 billion acres or 6.2 billion hectares. And between 1985 and 1990, we have over 200 million acres that were destroyed over that period of time, 5 years. And so there is a lot of biodiversity in tropical forests, but we cut down a lot of tropical forests because we produce a lot of products such as rubber, medicinal plants, fruits and nuts, and types of wood that we could get nowhere else. And so they are of great economic value to us. And one of the major causes of deforestation as a whole is tropical deforestation specifically, is this demand for mahogany and teak. So there also needs to be a distinction. The tropical forests are of great economic value because they produce rubber, medicinal plants, fruits, and nuts, and lots of types of wood. Whereas the consumer demand causes demand for mahogany and teak and tropical woods that are rare that cause tropical deforestation. These are one of the many causes of tropical deforestation. And so in tropical forests, there's more complexity, such as in South America, Africa, and Asia. Um, there's more complexity because people rely on a lot of the forest resources, such as water, fuel, and land for farming. So by going in and taking these tropical woods, this $8 billion annual industry, we're generating $8 billion annually from it. We're also taking away from a lot of the indigenous people and the resources that they need to survive and how they earn a livelihood. So remember this idea in economics that if you are efficient, something you take is always taking away from someone else. So by taking away from tropical forestry, well, we are taking away from indigenous people. Now, in the stand of a tropical forest, each of the commercial species only make up 10 to 20% of the trees. And so there needs to be selective logging in these forests in order to rely on this sustainable forestry. So remember, we're talking about ecological sustainable forestry, just not just intensive forestry. And so we need to do selective logging here more likely because it is in the tropics where there is more biodiversity among each stand. And so if they plant commercial monocultures in plantations, then that will also help increase the biodiversity within a single stand. And so, even though selective logging allows for forest canopies to stay relatively intact, so they're going to be still maintained, environmental impacts here are still going to happen. And so, next up, we are going to look at a science case study for selective logging and butterfly diversity in Borneo. So, Borneo is an area where there is tropical wood, and so we can see how are we going to manage a um, a forestry plan. And so, in Southeast Asia, including Borneo, selective logging is the primary method. So it's because it's a tropical forest that we see that the primary method is selective logging because the commercial species only make up 10 to 20% of the trees. The species that we want to cut down are only 10 to 20%. So this means that we're going to harvest all of those valuable trees in a specified minimum size. So we keep it to a minimum size and we don't cut down any of the others. And we harvest those trees that are valuable in the economy. And so usually the methods of extracting these trees is by bulldozer and overhead cable system. This is less than clear cutting, but a lot of smaller trees are going to be destroyed from the logging and from road building because you need roads in order to bring in bulldozers and overhead cable systems. And so smaller trees will be collateral damage in this case. And so we see that there is changing vertebrate species, the abundance and number that changes after this selective logging. So vertebrates are going to be uh, have changes in the number and abundance of them because of this selected logging. And since a lot of the vertebrates and insects are needed for a lot of the ecological functions, of the forests as a whole, John Willett decided to investigate, okay, how does selective logging affect butterfly species and insects as a whole? But in this case, specifically butterfly species. How does the logging affect the abundance and diversity of these butterfly species, which are important pollinators as a whole? So we can see here that there are different amounts of species and individuals as a whole that varies throughout the year, and that the number of individuals is greater than the number of species as a whole. And so Willett decided he was going to gather a bunch of data from March to November in 1995, and they studied butterflies in non-logged forest sites, and then four previously logged forest sites, and then two open areas from road construction and other development. So a couple details of the actual experiment were that the logged areas were harvested 6 years earlier, so there was this allowed for biodiversity to reach a normal level for a distributed forest area. So in this area, we see that there's a normal level because it was harvested 6 years earlier, but they want to see how it long term, how selective logging affects the butterfly populations. And so the species and individuals, they fluctuated over the course of the year, which was interesting. Now, between the logged and non-logged areas, there was not very much variation in the total number of species or individuals, but there was a difference in which species were where. So, as a whole, if we're looking at the species of butterflies, their individuals and species were the same, but in one habitat, there may be higher numbers, and in another habitat, there may have been lower numbers. So it seems like the total species level biodiversity didn't change, but the community level biodiversity changed. So the species present changed as the habitat changed. So each different habitat had different levels of biodiversity. So there's this difference between community and species because community is this larger scale biodiversity. And so if we're comparing to the Georges Bank fishery, we see that they both of these different examples are examples of changing the structure of the biological community, even though there's the same biomass overall. And so environmental scientists are trying to uh, look for applying these principles to ecosystems as a whole. And there's a lot of different factors that they have to account for, but we want to take into account these changes in biodiversity. So then the final thing we can look at is North American forests. So in the United States and Canada, approximately 50% of all wood in the world is produced. So um, deforestation in general isn't an issue, and there's actually been an increase in forest lands over the last several decades. But there are not old growth forests of the past generations. So this means trees that are old, but they're now mostly just areas where a lot of trees are being planted and then harvested, planted and harvested. That's a plantation. And this is a lot in the southern US and new forests that are growing on agricultural land. So new forests, um, these are all new forests and not old growth forests that are in the southern US on plantations and in on abandoned agricultural lands, lands that used to be agriculture but are now just abandoned. And so biodiversity and the community level, it isn't as great in these new forests and as happened in the older forests. And so new functioning biological communities haven't had enough time in order to develop in the new forests, and so they haven't seen or they haven't provided the same quality or quantity as the ecosystem services of older forests. So they don't provide as many resources for both animals and people as the older forests did. And even in the older growth national forests, the ones that are protected, then there are still several species that are endangered and threatened because of logging, that because of the habitat loss that they have. And so this is important to consider when we're managing North American forests as a whole. Now, both in private and public lands, there's variation in how they're managed. And so a lot of the private forest land, it's just owned by individuals and they don't really have interest in commercial forestry. Whereas there's millions of acres that are owned and leased to commercial forestry companies that aren't concerned at all with the forestry practices, how they affect the biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So overall, there is land that's not being used for commercial forestry, and then a lot of the land that is being used for commercial forestry, it's not been under sustainable amount of logging. So remember that ecologically sustainable forestry there, it's not being cared about. Now, those under the protection of the US and the public forests, specifically national forests by the US Forest Service, is how ecosystem management programs are being implemented uh, or are implementing values that are non-economic. So these values that don't have to do with just trying to get as much money as possible. Instead, we're actually trying to preserve the ecosystems, even though this is not without a struggle. So it's been getting better in recent years, but it still is difficult. Protection on biodiversity is also an important purpose of national forests, in addition to the logging and recreation and other human uses. So the National Forest Management Act, the NFMA, was originally passed in 1982, and this means that there needs to be provided this diversity for plant and animal communities, all based on the sustainability or suitability and capability of a specific land area in order to meet overall multiple use objectives. So these areas that are being logged need to still support the communities that they originally did for multiple objectives, not just for logging. And so usually the Forest Service establishes regulations, NFMA forest regulations that manage the ecological, economic, and social variables. So managing pretty much everything there has to do with forests, all of these variables in planning the management of the national forest under its administration as a whole. And so we're looking at, okay, we are implementing the regulations in order to keep biodiversity intact. And in the more recent years, there have been new regulations that look to the concepts and tools of conservation biology. So conservation biology was this thing that the Sierra Club was forcing them, trying to force on them, the Forest Service, in the 1990s. And so they were they have now created new regulations that are using Sierra Club's uh, tools of conservation that originally Sierra Club was telling them to use, but that they at first were losing the battle, but now they are winning the war overall uh, for maintaining biodiversity and keeping regulations well suited for forests. And so if it asks you what analogy is used for the Sierra Club, it's losing the battle but winning the war. So thank you for listening to section 3. I hope you got through all of it, and hopefully there will be more videos for the science packet to come. Thank you.